Now imagine, if you will, you are at a friend's house for dinner. Now at this point in time, you may have to imagine pretty well, because most people aren't going over to other people's houses. However, imagine, if you will, you are at a friend's house enjoying a meal. After the meal, the host brings out his dessert, and you eat this dessert, and it is just the most outstanding dessert. The best dessert you just you loved it, and you have to know how it was made. And so the host then goes into explaining all that went into making this dessert, what kind of things are in it, how it was put together, how it was cooked, all the details of how it was done, how you came to have this wonderful eating experience. And then a few days later, the host hands you the recipe. Now you have clear instructions so you can continue to enjoy this dessert as often as you would like. Well, this is kind of like what we have in the book of Hebrews. We have been given this awesome gift of salvation through Jesus, and because of what Jesus has done, his sacrifice. When we believe in Jesus, we are saved, and we have experienced forgiveness through his sacrifice and are now in a right relationship with God. And the book of Hebrews explains all of this and explains how it happened and what went into it and how it was all possible, and extols the greatness of Jesus, and just lays out God's plan and how this Jesus sacrifice reflects those of the Old Testament, or the Old Testament look forward to his. It explains all of this and pulls it all together. And then in the last few chapters, he gives us some clear instructions. Like, here's the recipe. He gives us some clear instructions for life and for pleasing God. Now, but here's the thing about a recipe. If you want that dessert to turn out right, what do you have to do? You have to follow the recipe. If you just read the recipe and set it aside, and then just start throwing things together, throw in ingredients, and maybe you forgot a couple, maybe you added something, maybe you didn't pay attention to the amounts of each thing that went into it, you didn't pay attention to the cooking time or temperature, your dessert is not going to be the same dessert that you experienced. Right? It's not going to turn out the way you would expect. You've got to follow the instructions. In the same way, if we want to please God and bring him glory, we've got some instructions to follow. We are told how to live in his ways and how to honor him with our lives. Now, here in Hebrews, we have seen some instructions already. In fact, the last half of chapter 12 we saw last week told us to pursue peace and holiness. He told us to watch out for each other so that all would remain faithful to God. And he told us to offer acceptable worship to God out of gratitude for all that he has done for us. But now we're in chapter 13, and in chapter 13 we're told some specific ways to do those things, to pursue holiness, to please God. So we have in chapter 13 this final set of instructions for life, for the life of faith. So we're going to look at these instructions for the Christian life, beginning in chapter 13 and verse 1. He says, "Let brotherly love continue." Now, that seems like a simple statement. Let brotherly love continue. And when you hear this term, brotherly love, it probably doesn't strike you as very surprising or very unusual, because we've become used to hearing this term. And we're used to hearing this idea of brotherly love used to express caring for other people. We even have a city called Philadelphia, which is the Greek word that means brotherly love. And so we call it the city of brotherly love. Well, Philadelphia means brotherly love. And so we've gotten used to this word, but let's take a moment here to understand what this word really means. Before the New Testament was written, this word was used strictly for the love shared between literal brothers and sisters. In other words, it referred to the love that was shared between actual family. But Jesus changed that. You see, Jesus told his disciples that they were brothers. And then the New Testament appropriated this word and started using it for relationship between Christians. So they started using this word to speak of the affection and commitment and the care that is shared between believers. See, Christians are family because we believe in Jesus. We are all connected to Jesus. We are his family. We are family. So Christians are family, and we act like family, and we care for each other like family. Now, let's stop for a minute and think about what that would mean. If you were to ask most Americans, what is most important to you? What will their answer be? Family. That is brotherly love. In the second half of the second century, there was between 150 to 200 AD, so about a little over 100 years since the church started. So the church was young at that point, but they had spread around the known world there. But there was a guy named Lucian, and he was a satirist. In other words, he was kind of like the Saturday Night Live or the late night talk show host of his day. And he commented on the church. And he made this comment with some amazement about how Christians treated each other. He commented about how they treated each other like family. And that they would actually share their stuff with each other. They would give things up. They were like family. In other words, they had brotherly love for one another. Do we understand this? We are family. It's funny because Doug and I were joking the other day about how we are blood relatives. Maybe not by our blood, but by his blood. Because Jesus shed his blood and died for us. We are related to him. We are related to each other. We are his family. So let brotherly love continue, he says. Now, if you notice, he doesn't say start loving each other like brothers. He says let brotherly love continue. In other words, it already existed. That brotherly love exists. He says, so now let's keep relating this way. Keep it up. And don't neglect to care for each other and to look out for each other. Let brotherly love continue. He goes on in verse 2. And he says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. So he's still talking here about showing love for others. But now he's talking specifically about those outside of the local church. This word translated hospitality is literally love for strangers or love for people you don't know. Love for people outside your group. So show love to those outside your group, someone you don't know. Now, this is most likely still talking about showing love to other Christians because the context, if you remember what we're talking about here, we are talking about the community of believers here. And so this would be referring to things like helping traveling missionaries. You know, like Paul and Barnabas and Timothy and Titus and Silas and We could go on and name these people. Apollos, who traveled around, and they would go from town to town, from church to church, and they would teach people about God, and they would share the gospel with people, and and they would be supported by the local Christians who were there. In fact, if they needed a place to stay, often they would stay at someone's house. And so this is the idea, that they would help each other. Even though you didn't know them, you might help them. But it could also be possibly talking about helping other unknown people in general who come to you. But we understand that Christians are to show love and act out of love and reflect the love of God. And just in case you think I'm saying that we shouldn't love people out who are not Christians, that's not what I'm saying. But even though specifically here in Hebrews it may be referring more specifically to other Christians, we know that we are to love all people. In fact, Paul wrote in Galatians 6:10, "So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to who? To everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith," especially to those who are believers, but to do good to everyone. But here in Hebrews, we read this and then we get this surprising reason for being hospitable. He says, be hospitable. Why? Because some have entertained angels unawares. In other words, some who were hospitable actually hosted angels without knowing it. Now, here he is most likely referring to Old Testament events, because he has done this over and over again. He'll talk about something and he refers back to these Old Testament events. And the most certain of these events would be when Abraham one day was sitting outside in the heat of the day, and he saw 3 men coming towards him. And what did he do? He got up and he offered them food and a place to rest. Well, it turned out that one of those men that he saw was the angel of the Lord, who then went on to tell Abraham that Sarah would have a son within the next year. And the 2 other men were other angels who then went down to Sodom and rescued Lot from Sodom. The thing is these angels came to Abraham and they had a great message for Abraham. Abraham was the host. He was the one that was giving of his material things, of giving of himself, and yet he received the greater blessing. And so the point here in Hebrews, when he says to show hospitality because some have entertained angels unaware, the point is not that we should go around helping people because they might be angels. The point here is that we should help people. And then you may find that God used your hospitality as a means of blessing you. Verse number 3. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. Now he's still talking about caring for people and helping others. And he says to remember these people. Remember those who are in prison, those who are being mistreated. Now, the word remember doesn't simply mean to think about them. The word remember means to take action on their behalf, to come to their aid, to help them. It's like in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. Noah and his family and the animals were on the ark. And it says this, God remembered Noah. Okay, so God had shut them in the ark. The rains had come, the floods came, everything, the whole earth was flooded. They were floating there in the water, and we're told that God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. We're talking here about God coming to the point where he says, okay, it's time for the waters to dry up. And so when it says that God remembered them, God hadn't forgotten about them. and then all of a sudden went, oh yeah, Noah. It means that he set his mind on them. He thought about them, and then he acted on their behalf. And so here we're talking about remembering or acting on behalf of those who are in prison and mistreated. Come to help those in prison and those who are mistreated. Now, when it's talking about those who are imprisoned and those who are mistreated, it's referring to Christians who are being persecuted because of their faith. You'll notice that at the end it says, you also are in the body. So we're talking about fellow Christians, people who are also in the body of Christ, who are part of your family through Christ. Come to help those who are in prison, who have been mistreated because of their faith. Fellow Christians. But then he also tells us why. This also tells us why, because they are related to Jesus. They're part of the body. They're related to Jesus, so you help them. But he also says this. He has this phrase. He says to do this as though in prison with them. I think that's kind of like saying, put yourself in their shoes. What if you were in prison for your faith? What if you were mistreated because of your faith? But the thing is to help these people who were being mistreated, who had been thrown in prison because of their faith, and to come alongside them and help them because you are the same, you have the same faith, the same Savior. That could be difficult to come alongside them and help them, because if you are then associating with them, that could cause people then to look down on you. It could then put you in the crosshairs. Maybe you would then be in danger of being thrown in prison or being mistreated. But what if you were thrown in prison or mistreated? What if you were in their position? How would you want other believers to act towards you? Would you want them to help you? So here we're being called to show compassion and to help fellow believers who are suffering for their faith. But how might we apply that today? I mean, most of us probably don't know someone who's been thrown in prison because of their faith. We might know someone who's being mistreated because of their faith. But how would we apply this idea today? I got several suggestions. Maybe it could be helping a refugee, someone who has been chased out of their home or even out of their country because they are Christian. Or maybe it's supporting people, or maybe a business who has been attacked for taking a stand for godly values and morals. Or maybe it's standing with a Christian student who goes to a public school and was told by their public school, you can't meet together, or you can't do this, or say this, or wear this thing because it's religious. Or maybe it's just coming alongside someone and encouraging this person who has been passed over for a promotion because of their faith. Maybe not happened all the time, but it happens. And maybe we just need to support those people. Or simply coming to the side of a person who is being teased or made fun of because of their faith. Now, you may not personally know anyone in any of these situations, but there are many ways that this idea could be applied in our world, in our lives. If you see a fellow believer suffering for their faith, then you show compassion and you help them. In verse 4, the next instruction, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Now, the first thing he says here in verse 4 is hold marriage in a place of honor. Marriage is a union ordained by God. God set it up, and God said this is what it is, and this is the way it should be. And it is good. And the institution of marriage and the marriage relationship should be highly respected. To hold something in honor means to prize it. It means that it's precious, it's valuable, it has great worth. And so the marriage relationship is unique and is a special relationship. And we are to treat it as such. Now, that means that if you are married, that relationship is your number one human relationship. There should be no other human relationship before it. But it also means that the way you act as a married person or the way you act toward a married person is different than to someone who is not. Let me give you an example of what I mean. A married person should not be flirting with or becoming emotionally involved with someone who is not their spouse. Because we honor the marriage relationship. That also, if you're married and you want to flirt, well, you have one person you can flirt with, and it's a good thing. Go do it. Flirt with your spouse. Have fun with your spouse, but not with anyone else in that way. And if you are a single person, you should not be flirting with someone who is married or becoming emotionally involved with someone who is married, someone else's spouse. We hold marriage in a place of honor, and we highly value that relationship. But here's the thing, we're told to honor marriage, but in many ways our world has dishonored marriage and has cheapened marriage. How have we done that? Well, we've dishonored it and cheapened it by foregoing marriage and seeing it as unnecessary because, well, we can just live together. We've dishonored marriage by changing God's definition of marriage. We've dishonored marriage by breaking our marriage vows or through just easy divorce. When marriage isn't easy or fun anymore, or for whatever reason, we just end it. You see, in many cases, marriage vows have become cheap and temporary and conditional promises. It's like saying, I do until I don't. I do until I want to do something different. But as Christians, we view marriage differently. We honor marriage. And this also means that we should be different. We should act differently. We are to keep our vows. We are to be fully committed and faithful to our spouses. We are to truly love and cherish our spouses. That is how we hold marriage in honor. Now, if that wasn't enough, he gives us one specific way in Hebrews here, one specific way for us to honor marriage, and that is by doing what is right and reserving all sexual activity for the marriage relationship. And he specifically mentions sexual immorality and adultery, and those are two different things. Adultery refers specifically to a married person who is unfaithful to his or her marriage. Sexual immorality is a much broader term, much broader idea, and adultery can fit within it. But sexual immorality refers to any sexual activity outside of marriage. And so this would include adultery, it would include any kind of extramarital affair, and even premarital sexual relationships. It refers to any kind of sexual gratification found outside of the marriage relationship. which, by the way, that would also include pornography. Any of this inappropriate sexual activity dishonors marriage and is opposed to the ways of God. And those who make a habit of doing these things will be judged by God, he says. So honor marriage and keep that relationship pure and honor God with it. Now we're going to stop here for today. The instructions continue, and we will look at those next Sunday. But I think we already have quite a bit to chew on from these first verses. There's a major theme running through them, and it is love. How do we love well? How do we love in a way that pleases God? A lot of times we use the word love and it's kind of vague. We'll love one another. Okay, but what's that mean? Say hi? Well, that's a loving thing. But how do we love well? What is brotherly love? What are these things that we've talked about? How do we do these things in a way that pleases and brings honor to our God? Love is an important thing to think about. And it's an important thing for us to live out. In fact, Jesus said in John 13:35, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples." By what? If you have love for one another. He says, they will know you are my disciples, my followers, if you love each other. Now, why is that the case? Because Jesus loved people. Jesus, there are many things you could say that he did that was loving. But the ultimate example of his love is when he went to the cross. When the just died for the unjust. When Jesus went to the cross and took the sinner's punishment on himself. You see, we are sinners. We deserve death. We deserve judgment. But Jesus, who was perfect and sinless and did not deserve judgment, went to the cross and took it for us so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be freed from that judgment and have eternal life and be made right with God. That's the love of Jesus. That's our example of love. So if we believe in Jesus, and we belong to Jesus, and we are following Jesus, then we will be like Jesus, and that means we love. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So I challenge you to think about this week. How can you love like Jesus? As we live this life of faith, we love. And this is pleasing in God's sight.